Hello everybody, my name is Ratnos. Player housing is coming to World of Warcraft. They made a big post about it like a week ago, which I made a video going over that you can click on if you want to go watch that. And in that video, they said there are going to be 2 zones coming for player housing. One of them was going to be like Elwyn Forest. It's not like a pre-existing part. They're designing a new zone for this, but it's like Elwyn Forest with a little bit of Duskwood and a little bit of Westfall. And then the other one is Durotar with a little bit of Ajara kind of baked in as well. And in that video where I went over that stuff, I mentioned the idea of doing a tier list of all the zones in World of Warcraft based on how good player housing zones they'd be. Then I thought about that some more, and that video would be really long and difficult to make, and also there's not really any bad zones to put housing in. So instead what I've decided to do is make a top 10 list. Even equally as exciting as a tier list video. So in this video, we're going to take a look at the challenge I've set for myself is like, if I was a Blizzard designer tasked with coming up with the next 10 places to put player housing zones, which let's not get ahead of ourselves here. They said they're starting with 2 and they don't want to make too many. So I'm not sure how fast we will add up to say 10. I think it would be sweet to do it fast, but there's a good chance that this will be something where it's like there's 2 for a year and then 3 and then 4 and like, you know, there's not a whole flood of these things, but just pretending that there could be. This is going to be a video where we go over those in order. Let me know in the comments below what you think of my list and if there's changes you would make. But without further ado, let's get started with number 10. All right, my number 10 zone to add to player housing of some kind is Ardenweald. Now this is a Shadowlands zone, so it faced some stiff competition from thematic zones such as Oribos and Korthia. But, okay, of the Shadowlands zones, I actually think there's a lot of cool aesthetics in a lot of them. Revendreth, Zereth Mortis even, Tazavesh, all those would be sweet. But I wanted to add just one, and I also think that Ardenweald is an extremely, like, breathtaking zone to look at, right? Like, you got these big trees, you got this very blue thing going on, which is kind of unique amongst WoW zones. There's not a lot of blue, very foresty, a little bit. I mean, it's kind of night elf, but not really, right? Like it's sort of adjacent, but not actually. And yeah, I think this would be a good zone. I mean, the challenge with doing a zone like Ardenweald is it feels like there would be a lot. If you had player built housing, it would kind of look out of place here, but I think that's going to be a problem with wherever they put these zones. Is, you know, you've got like the kind of the games aesthetic of places like Ardenweald or even Elwyn or Durotar, right? And then, you know, people's houses, depending on how customizable they can look, will kind of inevitably clash with the landscape unless they have like template outdoor designs that fit in with wherever they're built. But I think Ardenweald would be a good one as far as like nature themed, kind of outdoor, faction agnostic, although I do think this would appeal a little bit more towards the kind of alliance side rather than the horde one, but it's, you know, definitely faction agnostic. So yeah, overall made it to number 10 on my list. No slight on it being in the 10th spot either, but I had 9 other great places that I had to put higher on this list. Speaking of which, let's go to number 9. But first, a word from this video's sponsor. This video is sponsored by Boot.dev. Once again, big thanks to them for sponsoring so many videos here for my channel and encouraging me to actually make some of these videos. Boot.dev is a place where you can go to learn how to code, which is a valuable skill. In the world of AI, the difference between a good coder and a mediocre coder has gone up. You can make a lot of money from coding, but learning to code, becoming a software engineer, can be kind of boring depending on how you do it. I took some college classes for it. Actually, some of them were pretty good, some were kind of boring. But Boot.dev really focuses on making it interesting. They've sort of gamified the process of learning how to code. They've got an active Discord server as well. So you can use my code Dratnos. Definitely use the code, and then they'll keep sponsoring these videos. They'll keep encouraging me to make videos. It's a happy cycle. You'll learn how to code. You'll make a bunch of money. You'll use that money to buy Twitch Primes and channel memberships. It's a very happy cycle where multiple steps along the process, I make extra money. So yeah, make sure you do that. But yeah, code Dratnos, you get a bunch of money off of your Boot.dev. Buy a whole year, right? Save more money. You save more money. They get more money. Money's kind of created out of thin air. Pretty cool process. So big thanks to Boot.dev for sponsoring this video. Go check it out if you want to learn how to code. get a job, as your parents are always telling you to do. Let's go on to number 9. All right, for number 9 on my list, I've picked Grizzly Hills. This is an iconic zone for anybody who started playing back in the Wrath, TBC era. The music of this zone, I think, brings a lot of people back to a very nostalgic time, as you can hear playing in the background here. It's also, again, as far as like nature, outdoorsy zones go, I think it's among the best that WoW made, especially when you adjust for age, right? Because there's some similar vibe stuff you can get in like the Azure Span in the Dragon Isles. In fact, very directly referencing Grizzly Hills, but I don't think any of it hits quite as much as original Grizzly Hills. You got, of course, all the beautiful Wrath, Horde, and Alliance architecture that they added at this time as well. If you wanted to do sort of border zones, the border with Howling Fjord, with the mountains, very cool as well. But I think just a lot of stuff would fit here. Architecture looks good we've got a bunch of different architecture in this zone, and I think it all fits nicely in. You'd have your, little Venture Co. logging camp, or Alliance or Horde outposts. They all look good. Or the zone could just be in one of these big old trees, big old hollowed out tree. That could be a cool way to do it as well. But yeah, I think I kind of knew this would be somewhere on this list, and I was surprised it ended up being pushed down to number 9 even after I looked through the other options. But it's kind of so old at this point that I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure how many people that are currently playing WoW even still have like nostalgia for, Wrath zones. For me, this is my first, like the first expansion that came out once I was a WoW player was Wrath. I started playing in TBC, so I have a ton of nostalgia for this era of the game, but I know that's not everybody, so yeah, Grizzly Hills, I don't know. I mean, there are a lot of great zones in Northrend I could have picked. I mostly picked kind of one-ish per expansion-y area or continent. This barely beat out like Howling Fjord or Crystal Song Forest for me. Ice Crown could be cool as well, but yeah, I ended up putting Grizzly Hills on this list. The music as well, it's hard to pass up. All right, let's go on to number 8. All right, for number 8 on my list, I've picked Dunmorog, or Dunmorrow, depending on how you pronounce it. I've heard both ways. This is the dwarf starting zone area. You've got Ironforge up in there as well. It's got this beautiful snow everywhere, but I also think this one's got a ton of nostalgia for, again, very Alliance-centric here, so not something that a lot of Horde players would have much nostalgia for, and I'm primarily a Horde player, but I know there are a lot of Alliance players that really loved, the experience of firing up a dwarf and starting this area. And I think as far as the snowy zones go in WoW, this is definitely the most bang for your buck you could get if you were picking one to be the kind of place that you added as a player housing zone, right? The representative snowy zone of WoW. I think definitely here. Again, you could also do some cool stuff where you have some, dwarven mountain hold stuff built in, right? There's a bunch of tunnels in this zone that you could put in your player housing zone. You could have kind of a border zone with the wetlands. I guess this doesn't actually border the wetlands; it borders Loch Modan, but still, a lot of potential there. You could do valleys and hills, and again, depending on how the architecture worked here. If it was like template-based architecture, which we still don't know. We still don't know how player housing is going to actually work on this front, whether you're kind of going to have, a pre-built exterior that you decorate the inside of, or whether you can, like, make the exterior look however you want to your house. Because if it's pre-built, then it would be pretty easy to make, like a dwarven town thing using these houses and stuff, and that would maybe make it look really cohesive and appeal to dwarf players and, people that like this aesthetic. On the other hand, if you give everybody the freedom to build their own house exteriors, of course people would still have the option to do that, but I suspect public neighborhoods where people kind of just did whatever they wanted would look, there'd be a lot of architecture that would look kind of out of place in a place like Dunmorrow, right? It's not, but I guess that's kind of a problem with every zone. I've already mentioned it, I think, earlier, but yeah, definitely, if you had some Horde spiky stuff or like night elf architecture here in the snow, that would look kind of weird. I guess there's troll stuff here and gnome stuff in this zone. It all kind of works, so yeah, maybe it's more maybe there's more options that would look good than I thought. Oh yeah, you could do a lake. You do a frozen lake like this. Like imagine this in the middle of, with houses all around the edges of this lake thing. Could be pretty cool. All right, let's move on to number 7. All right, in 7th, with some kind of unlucky weather procced in the background so you can't see much. Actually, let me try raising my view distance here. View distance, because I don't think I have it on max. Yeah, okay. Let's see if this helps. Nope, it does not help at all. It's all snowy and foggy here. But it's number 7. It's Borealis, which I realized I've come here on a Horde character, so I can't really go into the city as much. Oh, okay. The weather's kind of cleared up as I've flown in here. But yeah, I wasn't trying to make this an alliance list, and there's some Horde-themed places higher up here. But in my opinion, if you want like an urban area in WoW, it's kind of... I mean, Borealis is definitely one of the 2 best sort of modern urban aesthetics that they put into WoW. Even though it is, you know, like the comparison, if you compare this to say Zul'Dazar for Horde, right? I don't even think it's particularly close. This place is such a vibe. Having like a district of Borealis as a player housing area, I think would really appeal to any kind of urban-minded players, because there's a lot of like nature-y places have been on this list so far, and of the first 2 they've said, you know, Durotar Coastline, Elwyn Forest are probably a little bit more, you know, rural or suburban rather than like straight up urban. But I think as far as that goes, you know, Borealis, Gilneas would be another example of places you could do where it's like this has got that classic sort of town, city even vibe going really well. Yeah, I mean, and of the cities, I think Borealis is one that really captured sort of that actual feel of a city rather than that sort of video game city thing where you kind of realize that it's like 2 blocks. Right here, there's actually kind of a substantial amount of stuff here. Obviously, it's still much smaller than any actual city if you looked on Google Maps, but it's enough that it kind of feels like a big city. And if you sort of sectioned off an area of player housing, you know, it wouldn't have to be accessible to the whole city, but if you could just see the whole city around whatever player housing zone, and it was, again, just like a little slice, a little district area, I think that could go really far for a lot of players. So, yeah, that's number 7 on my list. Let's take a look at number 6. All right, number 6, technically our first Horde-themed area on the list, as the Nightborn have joined the Horde. Although I don't really think of Suramar this way. I think of it still as more neutral from back in Legion. So, Suramar, this is another area that I think could be a really good sort of urban zone, although you can also do this, you know, sort of the city outskirts here, where it crosses between this nature area and the city itself. But yeah, the architecture of Suramar, and I think the scale of it, you know, we were talking about Borealis being a sort of one of the cases where they actually made an urban scale feel substantial enough. And I think Suramar is the other big example of this, where like this is a massive city that you could, you know, put player housing into potentially. Again, a lot of it's like already houses that are there rather than empty land where you could build houses. So that's a problem with both. I would say Borealis and Suramar, again, depending on how the player housing system actually works, it would be potentially hard to let people, you know, build a house in a Suramar district. I guess you could make kind of an empty district without any of the houses yet, and then let people put stuff in. But again, depending on how much freedom we have for like different exteriors, that would maybe look very like if they're all packed close together and you had a shared wall between a orc hut and a human house. That could look very, very weird in here. And also a lot of Suramar's aesthetic I think would be kind of compromised if there was a bunch of random clashing stuff in there. So those are maybe some downsides to it. But the upsides, I mean, again, I think that this was one of the most sort of striking city-feeling places in World of Warcraft. Unlike Borealis as well, both factions got to experience it, right? It was a hostile city, though. You'd kind of be sneaking around in here. There'd be guards that would do the whole, like, an illusion, what are you hiding thing. But also, Suramar city borders some nice outdoor, as I said, nature areas. It also borders the Nighthold, the greatest World of Warcraft raid of all time, potentially, in many's opinion. I think it's fair to say, I think Nighthold probably is still my top raid of all time. It's definitely up there. It's an extremely high quality raid, extremely high flavor raid. So depending on how they set up a zone in here, it could evoke some of the the Nighthold aesthetics. Looking across the bay at the broken shore and all the Legion stuff there, or you could do, again, like the vineyards on the outskirts here with the nature zone and the city zone sort of next to each other. I think a lot of cool stuff that could be done in this area, so that's why I put it at number 6 on my list. Also, again, technically some Horde representation, although not, the kind of in the classic sense. Although I think the classic sense of Horde representation, I didn't want to do stuff that copied the Durotar or Elwyn things, right? So I'm kind of making this list already knowing those are there. Otherwise, I would definitely want to put some classic Horde stuff, like, even Thunder Bluff kind of areas on this list. I guess that's spoilers for the rest of the list, so I'm going to stop talking before I spoil too much more of the rest of the list. Let's go on to number 5. All right, for number 5, we are returning to last expansion, to Dragonflight. I've picked the Waking Shores as a zone that I think would be really well suited again. You've got this sort of mix of ancient architecture out here, but also just incredibly breathtaking nature that has all this verticality as well, depending on how the player housing zones work, whether or not you can fly or dragonfly in them. I guess you probably can't, because they're small zones, and if you could dragonfly around, you'd cross the zone in half a second, so maybe that would be a problem for making a too vertical of a player housing zone. But you've also got this sort of red rock area, and then of course the lava, Obsidian Citadel sort of area of this zone. I think somewhere where like the lava and the green meet could be an extremely cool place to like take inspiration for player housing. We've got these sort of classic player housing zones of like peaceful, settled areas, or happy nature areas. Maybe housing or urban areas are already on my list. But imagine a player housing area that's like actually just in this hostile like lava area. All this brutal architecture here with the the spikes and stuff of an enemy citadel like that. This I think would be something that, if we were making a bunch of different types of zones, there are definitely a lot of WoW players that I think would like to have an option for something like that. So I would definitely want to add something like, again, like Dragonbane Keep area, or the kind of lava islands where the lava meets the water type thing. Like there's just so much color here. It's such a vibrant zone. You have the dragons flying all over the place as well. So I know it's kind of tough whenever I do content like this, which is not very often, but whenever I see people doing content like this, and a lot of it's kind of nostalgia based, right? We're making a top 10 list, and some of these zones are 18 years old, and some of them are like 2 years old, like this zone. A lot of people haven't built up kind of nostalgia yet for any kind of Dragon Isles stuff, but I think taking that aside, like just the quality of the zone is clearly so high. The vibe here, I think, is phenomenal. So that's why this went on my list, and that's why it went so high on my list. Originally, I had this lower, but I don't know. I flew through here. I logged out all my characters, right? If you're looking a little behind the scenes on how this video is made, I flew like all my characters to a different zone so I could just log between them once I actually started recording this thing. And during that process, I kind of realized, like, okay, Waking Shores has got to go up a couple of places on the list. Like, it's just too good. The different stuff that you've got going on here is just so... The one problem I guess I have with it is it maybe be hard to, like, put houses here. Like, a lot of the breathtakingness of this zone is... maybe would be attacked by building stuff on it, but I don't know. There's old ruins and stuff, and the Kalashi housing and stuff that is in some of these areas, and it kind of works. So I don't know. Again, I think this would be a slam dunk of a zone to add to our player housing options. So that's why it's on my list. Let's see what number 4 is. All right, for number 4, I've gone with kind of the original player housing in WoW. People will look at garrisons, but in a lot of ways, the Half Hill Farm down here was one of the sort of first player housing-y kind of things that WoW has ever had. And I think the vibe here of Valley of the Four Winds is really good for any sort of player housing thing. Like, Yeah, imagine if we had like this sort of farmland. You've got all this incredible, different looking, stuff that you've got here. All these massive plants, a bunch of houses that are kind of built here. All these Pandaren stuff that's in here, and we've got some marshes over here. We've got, of course, the town of Half Hill itself, which is built on this half of the hill, and I mean, even just they could basically just slice Half Hill into an instance and make that a player housing area. I think it would be pretty well received. A lot of people have a lot of nostalgia for Mop as well. It's another era of the game's history that, in particular, I think a lot of like high-end WoW players tend to have this expansion near the top of their list, just in terms of like the quality of the game at the time relative to the era. I think was seen as very, very, very high. But yeah, I think Valley of the Four Winds in general, and the sort of Half Hill farmlandy areas around here in particular, would make an extremely compelling place to set up a player housing area. It's also faction agnostic, which is a nice benefit, right? Both Alliance and Horde. Alliance came to Pandaria, Horde came to Pandaria, tried to destroy it a little bit. Not a big deal. These things happen. Slight war crimes committed. Water under the bridge. Both factions, have a nice connection to the Pandaren and the land. I think very high on the list. I mean, of course, number 4 on the list. But I think in particular, the other thing, the thing that I really do like about this place is that it does have that callback to, again, the first sort of housing-like feature. Maybe the feature that first awakened in a lot of people the desire to have something like housing in WoW was the Half Hill Farm. So I think that would be a lot of extra bonus points for picking a place like this to be one of the next zones to add. All right, number 3 on our list. We are really making the premium cut here of places that I think would be right next on my to-do list to add. And this is Nagrand, or Nagrand. I've heard it pronounced both ways. This is one of the zones that I think was most ahead of its time in terms of just how visually stunning it was for, I mean, this is, again, a 20-year-old zone at this point. That they've got in the game, and it had these incredible... So this is the Outland version of this zone, although it is worth noting there is a zone of the same name that was added in WoD. In WoD, Nagrand. I think it was a little bit less visually stunning. It doesn't have all this floating stuff, because this was all a product of the Sundering, I think it was called, when Outland got turned from a planet into a floating rock. You've got these incredible floating islands that just makes such a distinctive skybox that you can see. Not to mention the actual skybox itself with the incredible like floating, twisting nether mana lines that are going through the sky. I think the skybox here is not quite as cool as in Hellfire Peninsula. Actually, I had Hellfire Peninsula as a candidate for being on this list just based on the stunningness of looking up to the sky and the nostalgia of like walking through the Dark Portal for the first time, which, again, very old at this point. You have to be very old to have nostalgia for that, which I am, so I do. But yeah, this is a zone where, again, you've got the sort of nature. Now, the actual quality of like the ground, compare this to, say, Borealis or Suramar, just the amount of stuff going on the ground here is basically nothing, right? It's just kind of rolling plains and then a tree. The comparison definitely shows its age, especially if you fly around here and you actually look at like ground features and how kind of out of place everything looks, right? Like this abandoned armory here doesn't even have any different ground texture around the building. The building is just plopped into the ground. That's very different from how they do it with modern World of Warcraft. But remember that Player Housing would be making they'd be making a new modern zone based off of this aesthetic. So those sorts of things needn't stay true when they actually made this into a player housing zone. Now, I do have one final cook, because they did say, they're not just making zones that are like slices of existing zones, right? They're kind of making zones that are inspired by or not actually accessible in the world, right? There's again, the overlap between Elwyn Forest, Westfall, and Duskwood. There is technically a place like around where you kill Hogger that is that, like where those 3 zones do meet, but presumably they'll instead be kind of making a new area inspired by those 3 zones. And what you could do with Nagrand is you could make an area that's Nagrand, and it could have a button that you press in the middle that switches it from this timeline to the Draenor timeline. And what you'd do is you'd have the ground area be the same, right? But switching between it changes the background, right? So like you'd have, say you had your housing district built in an area like this, right? And you click the button and like the mountains change slightly, and you can see the different timeline changes to like how the mountains change, and the floating islands get replaced, obviously, with like the WoD stuff that was going on in the area. Just an idea I'm shopping around. If I was trying to pitch this as a player housing neighborhood, that would be I think a fun little gimmick to add, because this is one of like 2 zones that is directly related. Like, it's one of the least changed zones between WoD and TBC. This is the least changed zone for sure, and then Shadowmoon Valley is the other zone that shares a name, but of course is a very different vibe between those 2 expansions. Whereas here, it's a pretty similar vibe, I would say, Nagrand, between the 2 expansions. I didn't want to include, by the way, WoD Shadowmoon Valley or WoD Frostfire Ridge, even though I actually think those are both great player housing zones, because those were already garrison zones. And so I think they're probably pretty low on the list, as a lot of us have already spent a lot of time in those zones during garrison expansion, and probably wouldn't be racing to put a house there, although maybe some people would. But yeah, that was number 3. Let's go take a look at number 2. All right, number 2 on my list is Ashenvale. I think that this is certainly going to be one of the most requested things. You know, Night Elves have been a huge popular part of Warcraft in general, World of Warcraft in particular, ever since the game has come out. And of the initially announced zones, right, we don't have anything Elven, especially we don't have anything Night Elven, right? We have Elven Forest, we have Durotar. I think there's definitely going to be a lot of demand for a Night Elven tree kind of place. There's definitely a couple different options you could do for this, right? You could do like a new Teldrassil type thing. You could do Belameth, the new Night Elf capital in Emirdrassil. You could do Emirdrassil itself, right? And get some kind of Emerald Dreamy themed thing. But I think Ashenvale would definitely be a really good choice for doing a Night Elf themed place, right? You've got the sort of permanent elven blue tint gloom to the place that would go well. You could have all these nice trees with the kind of pretty purpley underleaf stuff. Sort of the kind of thick forest in every direction as you look around. I think would go extremely well. You could have the town with like, you know, a moonwell in the middle, or the lake like we have around Astronar, and you know, build a player housing town sort of along these blueprints as well. You could also include some horde theming in this zone if you wanted to. Of course, you could do a border zone. You could do a border zone with Stone Talon Mountains. You could do a border zone with Northern Barrens, although I think that the Northern Barrens aesthetic actually largely overlaps with the Durotar aesthetic and stuff. But you could do something like a Warsong Gulch kind of map where it's sort of the border between Ashenvale and another zone, and that could be cool. Again, yeah, maybe the Stone Talon thing. I actually don't think that would be the best way to do this, though. I do think if you're going to do an elf zone, I would just do a pure elf zone and just have it be, you know, the middle of Ashenvale, with, you know, the area for people, because I think there would be a lot of demand for just a pure, straight up, you know, Moonwells and Elven Lodges and, you know, Elements and Elune and stuff type player housing zone. Although, you know, maybe the option, depending on how customizable it is, maybe Horde players could come in and use the same area and set up a Warsong Logging Company V2. Again, depends on just how much freedom you have with the exterior of your buildings. But yeah, I think that this is definitely a slam dunk and is almost the first thing on my list of extra player housing zones to add, but not quite, because number 1 is Eversong Woods and Silvermoon City. Again, I think this would be a good one to do sort of you do some of the urban Silvermoon aesthetic. But this zone, okay, this is one of the most sort of popular ways to play WoW. Aside from Night Elves, it's Blood Elves, of course. A lot of people have really fond memories and attachments, and a lot of people who don't like the kind of grittier, war side, especially among Horde players, right? If you want a sort of clean aesthetic, not, dirt and grime and spikes and stuff, then Blood Elves often were your choice. And I think this zone has a lot of nostalgia for a lot of players. And it's just the chosen aesthetic of one of the biggest groups in World of Warcraft. So I think it makes a lot of sense to do in Eversong Woods. It's so bright. It's colorful. If you do something like the inside of Silvermoon City, which you still can't fly in this area, so you can see this area is really showing its age, but this would be a beautiful place to, again, like the Borealis or Suramar areas, to do like a district of. And also, it's high on my list because I think it makes sense given where the story is going. We know that the story spoilers, we know that the story is moving in, I think, next expansion to like Silvermoon, the Sunwell, Eye of Keldanas. There's some stuff happening up in this area, so that's also part of the reason it's number one on my list, is because I think it's the most realistic. I think we're gonna be in this area anyways. I think there's a decent chance of like a graphics update and adding flying to Silvermoon to Eversong Woods. So I think that this is sort of a wish and also sort of a prediction. Is just that this would be the area that makes the most sense to do one of these next after Eversong, or after Elwyn and Durotar. And again, just if we have only Elwyn and Durotar, the big thing that's missing is elves of some kind or other. And I think both Night Elves and Blood Elves are very high on that list. But I would put the Blood Elf one as slightly higher, given that place in the upcoming story, and also given personal Horde favoritism on my end. Sure, I'll admit it. I also have a lot of nostalgia for this zone. I started a lot of Blood Elves back in TBC, quested through this area. I actually have a decent amount of nostalgia for the Ghostlands as well, which is very much, of course, much lower on the list, I think, for good reason than Eversong would be. Although, you could do a border zone between Eversong and Ghostlands. You could do Isle of Keldanas as well. A lot of cool stuff going on up there. From the same era, actually, only a couple of patches into TBC was when Isle of Keldanas was made, so it's not particularly more polished or anything than Eversong Woods, but I think Eversong Woods would make the most sense. You could do like the Ruins of Silvermoon, a rebuilt, player-settled Ruins of Silvermoon after it's been recaptured. That could be a really cool way to go about doing this, right? Because like you could very quickly build up the sort of elven aesthetic if you wanted to in there, but it would make sense for like story reasons. Although I guess we don't know how much the player housing zones are going to be tied into the story versus if they're going to be sort of adjacent to the story or not at all related to the story. But I think there's a lot of different stuff you could do with this area, and a lot of players that would have this as the top of their list. So for that reason, it's the top of my list as well. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Let me know which of these ideas you are most or least excited about. Again, if you have favorite zones that weren't on this list, I'm sorry. The reason I didn't want to do a tier list for this is because genuinely, I think you could do something cool with pretty much every zone in WoW's history. Even this zone, which was never added to the game, but, could imagine if that's just a player housing zone, right? But there's just cool stuff you could do with actually everything in WoW's history. We could have, underwater habitats in Bashir. We could do, there's just so much, there's so much potential. And I'm reminded of what I say whenever they return M+ dungeons, where a lot of it's less like the base that they've chosen, and a lot of it is more what they decide to do with it. I think that's less true with player housing zones, because obviously the base aesthetic of these zones is really important. But I do think that particularly if they're willing to take creative license and do mixes of new zones or have interesting new things that aren't actually pre-existing out in the game world, then a lot of it's going to depend not on which zones they pick, but on how they decide to actually do that process of turning it into a real, player housing zone. So I will not be disappointed whichever zones they pick to add to this list, from this list. Again, I'll be excited the sooner they decide to do it. I would say don't get your hopes up for there being too many of these added too quickly, but I do think that it's a reasonable prediction to think that something like Eversong Woods would be the next on the list. And yeah, every single zone you could pick. Not added. There were a lot of honorable mentions that didn't get on this list. Hallowfall Obviously, just, with the crystal in the background changing colors, could be incredible. Basically, every zone they've ever made in WoW has so much potential for this project, which is part of why it's so exciting, and part of what made this a really difficult list to create. So anyways, that's enough rambling for me. Hope you've enjoyed this video. Again, I'll be checking what everybody thinks in the comments below. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one. Bye.